Morning, everybody. I'm really happy to see you guys, and I'm really grateful to be here in Oslo this morning, especially given that this is the show that I know the most about Oslo from, so I'm very happy to hear that you guys haven't been invaded. That's really comforting to know. I don't know if you guys know that this is like pretty much worldwide at this point, that people really follow this show. So if you do know anybody, because I assume everybody in Oslo knows anybody, you can tell them we're all waiting eagerly for season 2. Could they just kind of hurry that along? On the screen, I have an escalator, and you see 4 different paths of the escalator. Which way would you anticipate these to go? Do you think maybe, if we're looking at it, you'd go down one, down one, and then down the other, up one, up the other? That's pretty common, right? Let's see what that really looks like. Does anybody see a problem with what we expect to happen? What do you think would happen when somebody's using this escalator? They're like having to cross over one in order to be able to go to the other. So there's huge collision in that. This is really what we're talking about today more than anything else. This is accessibility for UX. Don't worry, it's much worse than you think. And my name is Elle Waters. I work for a company called Simply Accessible. We're a globally distributed company, so while it was a bit of a trip to get here from North America, it's something that we have lots of teammates in the UK and in other parts of Europe, so we're happy to be a part of this conference. A couple of years ago, we did a survey with UX professionals. And we asked them, why don't you integrate accessibility more into the things that you do? And we came up with 3 top answers. So survey says, the first answer, accessibility is intimidating. Yes, I think we all can agree to that. When I got involved with accessibility for the first time, this is kind of what my home library looked like. Because the first thing that people do when they try and get answers to their questions about how to be able to make something more accessible to people with disabilities is they go and they research, right? That would be the first thing that you do. And so I had piles of books and websites and everything, and I was trying so hard to learn, feeling like I was on this really fast learning curve. And so I would go online and I'd find these things where the W3C would have all of these different techniques, 203 general techniques, 94 HTML, even Silverlight techniques, don't use Silverlight, Flash techniques, don't use Flash, server-side scripting techniques, all of these things. So what do we call this in the accessibility industry? A good start. It doesn't matter. This is like the most exhaustive, obtuse kind of documentation that you can find online, and it's not even getting you through the door as far as what you need to know about accessibility. And then there's all these devices that people use. There's devices that allow people to speak into them, devices that allow things to speak for them, things that somebody can use a wand for, someone could use a foot for. There's all different manner of keyboards. It can be very intimidating to know, how do you possibly design and develop something and test to know that you've been successful for something like this? This is a refreshable Braille device. When I first saw it, I thought it was a Casio keyboard. It's mysterious looking. It has mechanical keys that rise and fall with different Braille imprints on it electronically. It's an amazing device, but it's as foreign to me as anything I could imagine. And then the most popular screen reader around has the most intimidating name of all. It's called JAWS. I took one look at this and I thought, I'm out. This is incredibly intimidating. Number 2 answer was, accessibility is hard. Yes, And I'm sorry, and feel free to leave if you're hoping that you're going to get accessibility is easy today. It is hard. But when you look at it, everybody has days when they try for 100% excellence and they miss, right? That makes me sad. Everybody has times when features get released and you didn't test them with real people so that the yes button is right next to the red and the no is next to the green. And while that may not make a lot of sense to us, at the same time in another country it may make good sense to people. And sometimes we secretly hope that good enough is just good enough after all the work that we put into something. This is a picture of the top of a ramp, the top of a wheelchair ramp at a building in Toronto where I was visiting. And the sign reads, "No wheelchairs permitted on ramp. For wheelchair access, please use west entrance." And the reason why, even though it has a button to push the door open, the reason why is because they didn't actually measure the gradient sufficiently enough. And so after they put all this time and effort in, they found out that it was too steep of a gradient to be able to pass the regulations to allow somebody to easily be able to use their wheelchair to be able to get into the door of the building. So sometimes, maybe they just think, well, it would just be much easier if maybe they just went around to the back door, because that way we don't have to redo all of this work. And that's understandable. This is a picture of my niece who's named after me. Her name is Elle, and a good friend of mine, Dylan. And a couple of years ago, I was in the car with her driving to Austin, Texas for South by Southwest, and her mother, my sister. And I was telling my sister about how awesome Amazon Prime is because, yes, I'm pretty addicted to it because we live in the world UPS hub. I live in Louisville, Kentucky, and so I can order something and 2 hours later it magically appears on my doorstep. So I think I was probably trying to evangelize her, but I was telling her, hey, I can add you to my Prime membership, and then you too can, order things you don't need with just one click. And so I went onto my mobile device. I went onto my, at the time I had a Samsung and Android device. And I went on there and I decided, okay, I am a power user, right? Not only do I work on the web, but I'm, as I mentioned, an addict when it comes to Amazon Prime. I know the website really well. So I went there, and of course I got this mobile view, and I thought, okay, that's fine. I wanted to add my sister to my Amazon Prime membership, and I looked at those links, and I couldn't find an easy way to get there because it was so differently designed. The content looked really different than the desktop site. So I thought, well, when in doubt, you Google it, right? So I went there, typed in, how do I add a family member to my Prime membership? And I see a link, and these are Amazon links, so I figure that's pretty trusted, so I'm going to click to that. Of course, it goes to a desktop viewport type site, a desktop version. And that was difficult, but I'm looking and I see, go to Manage Prime Membership. That must be it. So I click on that link, and I get to, hello, Elizabeth Waters, member since, and it's the same page. And I think, okay, well, there's surely some path that I'm missing here. So I scroll down, and I look, and I see down at the bottom, I see Amazon.com full site. And I'm like, I'm going in. I know that it's a complicated website, and if any of you guys have been to the website, the desktop version, you know what I'm talking about. It is like a focus management nightmare when you think about how many different kinds of interaction patterns that they expect to kind of just assault people with. And yet, I love the site. I buy a lot of stuff, so it must in some way work. So I go there and I think it's okay. Even though this is on my mobile device, I can manage this because I know the site really well. So I go, and yes, it's this lots and lots and lots of content and images and everything, but I know where that menu is, so I click on that menu, I find that link, manage my Prime membership, got it. I know exactly what to do. Hello, Elizabeth Waters, member since November 2. And all I wanted to do was be able to add my sister to my Prime membership account. And this is not traditionally considered an accessibility issue. It took me 5 minutes and a little bit of swearing in the car to get through this before I gave up. But Imagine what it would be like if you had one or two other challenges in trying to be able to access this content, and how difficult it would be. And so it's something to consider that disability is a usability amplifier. And so think about that for a second. If it takes me 5 minutes to be able to get through a particular user task flow, it may take somebody 20 minutes, it may take someone 30 minutes if they have a disability that makes things go a little slower, if perhaps they're challenged in other ways where they have a combination of things that are going on. So accessibility is hard because good design is hard. That's why accessibility is hard. Number 3 answer, accessibility is not my job. Really? So when putting together things for a conference a couple of years ago, it was a UX conference, and I asked them why they didn't want to hear more about accessibility at conferences. And the answer was, my work does not involve people or work with people with disabilities. Or I don't have a lot of direct need to learn more about accessibility. Basically, it's not that person's job. Okay. 1 in 7 people in the world have a disability. That's 15% of the world population. That's according to the World Health Organization, and you can go to google.com/accessibility and find lots of great information. Basically, 1 billion people in the world have some form of disability. So that's 15% of the world's population, and for developers, versus 5.2 of desktop internet users. That's the stat right now that you guys are probably still suffering through having to support. Just putting that in perspective there for a second. $8 trillion of annual global disposable income. So there's your marketing bit right there. $8 trillion of annual global disposable income. It's different according to different countries as far as how much, but it ends up basically working out to being a pretty significant user segment. And then last bit, as far as business case, when looking at whether or not accessibility is worth taking on, everything you do to make something work better for someone that's blind or deaf helps with findability and search engine optimization. Everything you do to make things work for somebody who's low vision or has mobility challenges actually works and helps with your mobile strategy. And everything that you do to make better for someone with cognitive difficulties helps everyone. Braintree just recently released this stat that mobile transactions are expected to increase by 74% over the next 3 years. So I think that most organizations are really trying to find out how to be able to grab hold of that and how to be able to manage a mobile strategy that will put them in the forefront of their industry. So looking at this, here's another real-world example of how things typically go within a web project lifecycle. The accessibility requirement would be entrance is accessible to wheelchair users. So you say, check. We have a button so that somebody can push the button, the door opens, and a person can use their wheelchair to get through. Unfortunately, there's a missed requirement because that same place is actually that same door is on the top of a stairway. So we would say that's a missed requirement, right? Because they didn't put that all in there. So we're going to log a defect. That's what we'll do. And so the remediation, the fix, is basically put a sign up that says, access from alley off Dundas Street, right? And the sign is on the door all the way past these stairs. So the issue's resolved because it's not really somebody's job to figure that out. And I would ask you guys, if it's not your job, whose job is it? If you work in any capacity to put digital content out there, then there is a share of responsibility that you have and an opportunity that you have. This is a building that I went to that was specifically designed with inclusion in mind. And I thought it was really interesting to see this in the built environment. Beyond just having the bare minimum and having a wheelchair ramp and things like that, they did things like this. So instead of just a simple button, you can see they have this long panel, because sometimes people don't always have full mobility of their hands. Even if they're in a wheelchair, they may have a motorized scooter, and this allows them to be able to bump it with their wheel and still be able to open the door. Just a small change, but actually really thoughtful about different ways and modes that people might use that. Additionally, all of their television sets are tilted down towards people, but are above so that nobody's like knocking their heads, because they'll have blind individuals who may be using the wall to be able to give them, you know, some bearings on things, and you don't want them to be knocking their heads into the television sets. And then finally, one of my favorite things is there are people who have low vision that may not want to be using a lot of assistive devices in order to be able to walk. And yet they have these edges that are just a different shade of tile along the wall to show people where the wall is so that they can find it, because it's really high contrast. And then at the very end of each hallway, they have a circle that's rubberized, and it has a tactile feel so that somebody understands you're at the end of the hallway. It's kind of a nice thing, and it didn't take a lot of effort for them to be able to design things inclusively. So is this accessibility, or is this just good design? Is this something to consider? This is Terry Fox. He was a marathon long-distance runner in Canada. And you can see he has a prosthetic leg. And he pretty much made history because of the fact that he's this tremendous athlete. And yet, at the time, people were not used to seeing people with disabilities perform and excel in these athletic environments. So the question is, this is Amy Mullins. She's an artist, an actor, and a model. She too has prosthetic devices. She has them made by Steve McQueen at times, where she will have these beautiful works of art, or she, like Oscar Pistorius, will have these amazing prosthetic limbs that actually, when she runs faster than someone who was born with femurs instead of someone who is born and has these. So is this accessibility, or is this just really good design? This is a picture, an image still of her when she was in an art film, and she was one of the only people who could be able to do this without CGI because of the fact that she can wear prosthetic limbs. So she says she has the advantage of being 5'5" or 6'2" on any given day, whatever she wants to be. And then finally, this is Gianna, and she was a little girl who lost her leg in an accident and started basically becoming a recluse for years because she was embarrassed about going outside, and she wasn't very comfortable using her new leg. And there was a company that started to design an interface where children could design their own prosthetic limb, and they could pick the colors they wanted, they could make it look like a transformer, they could make it look like Iron Man, or they could pick their favorite colors. And this is a picture of her after she's gotten comfortable with the leg that she designed for herself. So the question again is this accessibility, or is this just really good design? So today I'm going to share with you a Web Professionals Inclusive Design Coloring Box. I would have called it a toolkit, but if we're in a design class, it should be something more friendly and should be more playful and more squishy. You have plenty of time this week to be able to get all of the crunchy kind of dev stuff, so we're going to have a coloring box. And those of you guys who have these will be using these in a little bit. And if you don't, it's okay. There's actually an old school way to do it beforehand. So, starting with user research. This is something that those of you guys have done work within UX and design. This is a way for you to feel comforted to know that a lot of these things you already have in your coloring box. So we're just going to point out the benefits to people with disabilities. We create personas. This is a good example of a persona. This is John. We create full personas of people who have rich lives, and we work with client teams to make sure that it caters towards what they themselves are looking at for their primary user task flows. And then we happen to include some disabilities with those people. We don't create accessibility personas, we create real client personas. So this is an example of some personas we created for World Vision Canada when we were working with them. This is John. He's 27 years old. He's single. He has no kids. He's a gallery artist, and he works from home. And he's a human rights advocate. He promotes rights for underserved communities and uses his artwork to be able to create that awareness. And he's thinking about applying to become a child sponsor ambassador. John needs clear, simple instructions, and he wants to avoid getting lost in details. He makes tons of to-do lists all the time, and he frequently feels overwhelmed when things are too chaotic and too much is going on. He has autism spectrum disorder. This is Rose. She's 24 years old. She's married, but she has no kids. She's a graduate student and a journalist. And because she's a journalist, she works really unusual hours. A mix of short and long trips for her work. She focuses mainly on developing nations in her journalism and what she reports on. And she manages most of her life while she's on the move. And so she usually uses a mobile device because of that. And she wants her life to be effortless and forward-thinking. She wants to be ready for whatever's next. She's on the cusp. And so she has very little patience for things that waste her time. And Rose has been almost completely deaf since she was born. This is Mary. She's 35 years old. She's married with 2 children. She's an incredible musician. She plays 11 instruments. She's a professor of ethnomusicology. And she wants to inspire students with new ways of creating music and has a grant for teaching music as advocacy. And so she's developing the student performance fundraiser for World Vision. And she's been blind since she was 13. She needs significant trust in others, and she has parent fatigue, which is really significant. This is an example. So all of these personas are based as an amalgamation of real people that we do a lot of usability testing with. And we'll see if we can get the audio to come through. This is a clip of when we're setting up, we do remote moderated usability testing with people with disabilities. And so this is to give you guys an understanding of what it's like for somebody who uses a screen reader. Just if you've never heard when somebody uses one, if you try to use it yourself, that's great, but it is a different experience if you use it on a daily basis. So this is one of our participants just setting up the software to get ready for the study. So I don't know about you guys, but that's a little fast for me. The average screen reader user listens to stuff about 200 words a minute, much, much faster than the untrained human ear could listen and actually parse anything. But that's pretty common, actually. So just as an example of how people consume information when they're using a screen reader, they consume it via, for those of you guys who are thinking on the technical side, they basically go in a linear format by consuming it via the document object model. So they're looking at it from a DOM perspective. And because of the fact they're really comfortable using a screen reader, they start parsing it very, very quickly. This is Sean. He's 31 years old. He's engaged. He doesn't have any kids yet. He's a UI engineer in Palo Alto, and he has a game-changing idea. He's incredibly competitive, very, very driven. So he's a member of the Young Entrepreneur Council, which is a made-up organization, but probably something like that in Palo Alto. He's creating a micro-donation disaster relief mobile app to sponsor at-risk people groups. And he wants to be updated on all of the latest technology, and therefore he gets bored with technology very quickly. He's probably at this conference, actually. He has low vision, and because of that, he needs to magnify his screen 400% in order to be able to see the content that he's interacting with. This is Maxine. She's 61. She's widowed. She has 2 children and 5 grandchildren. and she owns her own bakery, but she's looking to retire and spend more time with her grandchildren. And so she's looking to spoil every grandchild this year. And she's looking at this World Vision gift catalog for birthday and holiday gifts for her family. She's very much an extrovert. She's got great people skills. She has severe arthritis from years of computer work. Okay? So these are the personas that we created, and it's a pretty common thing that we do with teams because we want them to understand accessibility from the perspective of how people might be using their content. Buttons can sometimes be too close together for me, and I can't click small targets. Which one of these different personas, who of these people might have said something like that? You're going to have to yell it out, because Maxine, you think? Yeah, Maxine, that's a really good guess. Because if Maxine is having difficulty being able to hold a mouse because sometimes it just hurts, and she might have hand tremors, it's going to be difficult for her to click something that's a small target. Good. Maxine. Next, I bump up the font size in my browser to make text easier to read. I hear Sean. Anyone else? Sean. Very good. Because of the fact that he has to be able to read, sometimes he will bump up just the font size. It's very common because he doesn't want to get that horizontal scroll that you get when you expand and magnify the entire screen. You see captions as an alternative, but for me, they're my primary format. So I hear some people saying Mary. This is captions for video. I hear Rose. So what is the difference between captions and text transcripts? Does anybody know? Captions are actually for people who are hard of hearing or deaf because it's the visual subtitles that you'll see on a video. But if you're blind, you won't have access to be able to read those. And so you're either going to listen to the audio or you'll read a text transcript. So in this case, yeah, it would be Rose. I need to use the keyboard, but on certain web pages I just can't. Anyone? Who would be somebody who absolutely needs to use a keyboard? Yep, I hear Mary. That's good. And then finally, I'm worried that I won't be able to use the internet to do my job. So I hear John. Anyone else? Actually, everyone. Truly. When we're doing usability testing, some of the things that happen is we develop these kind of very intimate scenarios when we're working with people and trying to work through a client's website with them. And we hear a lot of anxiety, we hear a lot of frustration, but it comes out of a fear more than anything else. It's not that people are angry, they may be angry, but anger comes from somewhere. And they're really afraid because at any moment that could stop working for them. And then that has really serious ramifications for them, especially if it involves their job. So here's just another, I have a couple of slides that show a list of common things that we hear. So it's hard for me to remember things from one page to the next. John, typically. With a limited view of the page, it can be difficult for me to see how one part of the page relates to another. Who might that be? So I think if you zero in on limited view, you can think about Sean, and he's got this very small view of the whole page. So it's difficult for him to see how one thing might relate to another. English isn't my first language. ASL, American Sign Language, is. I need to translate everything as I read. That's actually more common than you would think. I feel a lot of eye strain and my eyes get tired after a few hours of work. That's very often something that we hear from people who have low vision. So again, that would be Sean. So by using these user personas, it's something that you can start to think about the things that they encounter as they're working with your content. And it's less about a technical standard and much more about designing things to where they're easy to use for everyone, but focusing, if you design for the needs of the few, you meet the needs of the many. So if you incorporate this into your design and you look at persona mapping, as a user experience champion, oftentimes you have different roles in what you're doing. There's people who do interaction design, there's people who are information architects, people who are visual designers. And what it's really helpful to do is to look at who is your primary user and who's your secondary user in each of those roles. So if you're an information architect or a content strategist, then we would recommend that you focus first on neurally diverse users, people who may have cognitive challenges, who may be somewhere within the autism spectrum, and people who are non-native language users. That's always a really good way to do it, and to do this, you can conduct usability testing with paper prototypes. You can sketch a napkin and be able to sit down with somebody and be able to get their feedback. It doesn't have to be a working prototype for that. Persona mapping for a visual designer, focus first on low vision users, which also maps very well to people with mobile devices, and also colorblind users. And you can conduct usability testing with high fidelity mockups, whether that be an HTML prototype, if you go straight into that, or if you're talking about a Photoshop file, you can do user testing with them. Persona mapping for the interaction designer. This is very important as a step, so if you don't have somebody who's working through a task flow and you're thinking only about modules and components, I would definitely encourage you to think about this. And so as your first user, mobility challenged users, second user is blind users. So be thinking about how somebody gets through each of those different kinds of interactions for the workflow that you're presenting on your pages. And you want to conduct usability testing with HTML prototypes, but let me strongly encourage you to make sure that you have really looked at it with just using a keyboard first. You don't need to use a screen reader because you'll never end up listening to it as quickly, as fast, or like Mary does, right? But what you can do is you can test everything with a keyboard so that you know that there's not any stops in that workflow. So here's 5 things to remember, and this is the only 5 things that you really need to do from a design perspective in order to be successful with accessibility. The first one is obvious wins. Call it what it is. How many of you guys are familiar with this particular pattern, this mobile pattern that Facebook put out years ago without really doing any user testing and confused the world on their mobile website? And for a while, there was like a period of time where it was between pancakes and hamburger, and at some point, the savory fans won, so now we call it the hamburger menu. And even today, in usability testing, this baffles people who are not like us, who are web professionals, and we see it all the time, so we know what it's supposed to do. This confuses the hell out of them. And yet, in usability testing, they found that the menu icon itself doesn't translate very well to people who are not like active users. And the word menu, it did all right. But the thing that did the best was when you have the icon with the word next to it. It was so obvious, so clear what that pattern was that people did really, really well in usability testing. So obvious wins. When you have a choice between something kind of brand new and slightly mysterious for an interaction pattern and something that's very clear, obvious wins. The second thing, make it simple and make it easy. So we have on our website, and I encourage you to go and use anything that you find that's useful. We have an examples area. It's basically like our lab setting. And we have a form validation pattern that we put through years of usability testing. You don't have to make all your forms look like this and all your error messaging look like this. But with that said, one of the things that's a surefire way to get brand loyalty and to get people to really come back to your site is how they recover from mistakes when trying to complete a form. How well you help them recover from those errors, they've shown that that creates an incredible amount of brand loyalty. So a few things about this. For multiple errors, we typically put a summary bucket of the errors at the top of the page. That makes it really simple and easy to understand. We put the number of errors that somebody's encountered. We make clickable links for those particular fields that are in error so that somebody can go directly there. That makes it much easier for people who have limited mobility to be able to get directly to fix the issue that they find. And then this next one's a little bit on hyperspeed, but we've had success with elderly and people who have limited mobility, and that is the ability to click a link and go to the next error. So they are able to skip through several different form fields that are not in error, so they don't have to tab 30 times just to be able to get to that next error. This is simple. This is easy. There's no question what the error is, how that error can be fixed, what they need to do to be able to fix it. The third thing is make it consistent and make it predictable. I didn't say make it ugly or make it dumbed down or overly, simple. Make it consistent and make it predictable. How many of you guys have a pattern library or a design system that you're thinking about or that you're in the process of working through? That's good. See, you will succeed. That's good. For those of you guys who have been a little daunted, a little overwhelmed by the idea of creating a pattern library, I encourage you. One of my favorite people said, a shitty pattern library is better than no pattern library at all, especially from an accessibility point of view. Because if you create bad modal dialogues, but you create the same pattern every time, then we can work with you to create a beautiful modal dialogue, and that beauty just cascades throughout. So pattern libraries are great because it means that you're not presenting your users with 8 different kinds of error messaging. You're not presenting them with 5 different ways to be able to fill out a form or anything like that. They know once they have gotten into your system, they understand what it means. Change your perspective and assume nothing. So this is a photo. How many of you guys have your straws? Yeah? Great. Okay. I'm going to bring up another file. And if you don't have a straw, you can pretend to have a straw just by holding your hand. And you can do it as though you're holding a milkshake straw. So what we're trying to think about is how to be able to understand what's something called proximity. So what I'm going to do is I'd like everybody to hold up their straw and look through it with one eye and close the other eye, and I'm going to have a web form on the screen, and I want you to fill out the web form. I'm going to take a photo of you. And so when you're done, you can go put your hand down. So what was the pattern, that the movement that you guys found yourselves doing in trying to fill out this web form? Right. You're finding yourself moving from left to right and left to right and left to right. And the biggest problem with it is, this is an example of what it would be like if you were somebody with low vision, you'd zoomed in your screen, or you're using a screen magnifier. Do you see what the problem is for people if they're looking at this? They're going to look at the question, and they have to go all the way over the screen in order to be able to find those answers. And who knows what that yes or no really is referring to when it's this far away from the question. And then so we're creating this pattern where it's left to right, to left, to right, to left, to right, and that's creating some muscle memory for your users, right? They're used to being going left to right to left to right. So then the next call to action, quit. No kidding, right? I'd quit. But then they're thinking, okay, well, I went this far over each time, so I'm going to go this far over the next time. The next call to action, previous. And when you look at this is not really, in a design context, something that we would recommend for a lot of reasons. But one of the biggest problems that we see is we're grouping the wrong chunks of information. So we're grouping questions together and answers together. And we're not grouping related pieces of information in proximity to each other. So this is a law of proximity in a design perspective. And while it would be tedious for us, or it might kind of disturb us a little bit if we don't have any visual disabilities, this is not exactly a perfect simulation of what it's like to have a low vision kind of experience. But it gives you that for the purposes of this conference. And it recognizes how difficult it is to be able to associate these kinds of pieces of content. And then when you look at these buttons, they have something what we call visual weight in a design perspective. They have equal visual weight. So the only way that you know which button that you really want to select is by actually reading the content. So it increases your cognitive load to have to be able to do that. So here's the magic of what CSS can do for us. So the markup's no different behind the scenes. And that markup could have been perfectly coded for somebody who uses a screen reader, but it was totally unusable for somebody who might have low vision. So let's try again with your straw or your hand and try and fill out the form now. A little bit easier, huh? You're not going to eliminate the left-right movement entirely, nor should you necessarily do that. It's not a recommendation that all your forms need to look like this, but it's definitely a recognition of the more streamlined the experience, the better it'll be for everyone, as well as people with low vision. And you can imagine that this probably works a lot better on a mobile device. And it groups the right chunks of information together, right? The question with the answer. That's a much smarter way to group these things and have them in proximity. And then if you see the way that we treated the buttons, next is the very first button that they go to, because that's your primary call to action. It's what you want users to do. And then they have an immediate feedback of how to get to the other ones if they need that. So use layouts to create the right chunks of information and group them together, and a pattern of use to lead that eye to action. If we look at this, we can see it's a pretty straightforward experience after that. We have these UX cards that we're putting out. They're kind of in beta, and this is one of them. It's the straw test, which is this. And we have a few others, which just allows you to get outside of the way that you normally see your own designs. Another one is to look at just the headings on the page. And can you understand the context of the page just by reading the headings? Another one is imagining you can only move forward using only a keyboard and you can't move backwards. Can you do that? And so there's a lot of different ways to be able to look at the content that you produce. And when you put these design constraints on what you do, it's something for you to understand how to be able to make your designs bulletproof. And last but not least, go see. So in Agile terms, that's Gemba, lean methodology. The idea is all of this is great. You should build these best practices in everything that you do, but ultimately the true measure of whether something is accessible is whether people with disabilities can actually use your product. So if you're not conducting usability testing, don't feel that you have to spend a lot of money. Don't feel that you have to do heat sinks and heat maps and things like that and work through 6 weeks of user research that no longer is valid because you have this really rapid sprint cycle. Instead, think in terms of guerrilla marketing kind of usability testing. and look at your customers and find out if you can get these kinds of needs from that. And if not, there's lots of disability advocacy groups that you can work with to get immediate feedback on your prototypes, on your designs, on your mock-ups. This is a confirmation about why it's important to do user testing. As I mentioned before, we do a lot of usability testing at our organization, and this is blurred out because it's an actual client website. But what we found that was really quite surprising is that in this day and age of responsive with different breakpoints, we found that a lot of users were viewing a different breakpoint than their clients, the client really actually anticipated. So people who have, like this user, Amy, she has a bookmark bar that she has up constantly, and that was throwing everything into this portrait mode for her to be able to view her site. Another user, we found actually 3 out of 8 users that use screen readers weren't even using a monitor. They don't need a monitor. They live at home. They're blind users. What do they need a monitor for? And so a Windows system throws that into this 135 pixel by 60 pixel viewport for the browser. So the browser's still running, but it's not viewed at full screen. And what that did was that gave these users the mobile version of the site, but they were using desktop screen readers to interact with the mobile version and keyboards. So it was a different experience entirely. Blew our minds. It changed how we did usability testing, how we did our own accessibility testing for clients, because we recognized you can't make assumptions about what people might be doing and what they might be using. There's too many configurations, and the spectrum of human needs and accommodations and what people prefer are too vast to try and predict. So the only thing that you can do is use wonderful best practices and then go see and actually test with people. And last but not least, I would just encourage you guys to just dive in. There is no need to have a fear of failure when it comes to accessibility and inclusive design. Make mistakes, but earnestly try and understand how to be able to build more inclusive things. And you already have the tools, much like Dorothy with the shoes in The Wizard of Oz. You have had the power all along to do this because you already know how to be able to design or develop a web page or a mobile app or a digital interface. You already know that because that's what you're in this particular industry. And you have those skills. And do your best with that and follow those standards and best practices, and you'll succeed. We did a research project for a client, and we looked at 4 years of data that we did accessibility assessments for. She wanted to know how many of the issues that we find that impact people with disabilities were actually directly related to web standards. Over 60%, almost 70%, of the issues that we found that impacted people with disabilities were directly related to web standards. That's pretty stunning. So if you think about it, if you have pristine semantic markup and you design your web pages with proximity in mind and color contrast in mind, and these kinds of things that you already know to do in your roles, then you've actually accomplished a great deal towards more inclusive designs. So it can be tough, but you guys are already equipped, and you're already superheroes in what you do. So design and code kindly. Thank you. I think we have a few minutes left. Yeah, a few minutes for questions, if you guys have any. No questions about accessibility, really?
Maybe one.
Yes. Yes.
How many of them are really have challenges with which affect reading websites or interacting with user interfaces in general?
Right.
I think if you are sitting in a wheelchair, you still can use a computer normally.
Sure, sure. So the question is, that number is huge, right? 15% of the world population having disabilities. And the question is, how many of those people where their disability actually impacts their ability to use the web? And while there's no easy way to be able to come to that number, I would say that the largest group of people, there's two large groups of people who have disabilities in that number. And it's not blind users, actually. Most people, when they think about web accessibility, they think of blind users. It's people who have mobility challenges and people who have cognitive difficulties. Those are the largest groups of people with disabilities. And then visual impairment, there's 7 times as many people with low vision as there are people who are blind, which is why you see us preferencing low vision and really kind of talking about that, because it isn't as well known. So there's not an easy way to come to that question, but when people have mobility challenges, whether or not it's arms and they're one-handed and they're having to use the web with just one hand, or whether or not they have limbs that it's just from the waist down, actually it's a great question. We'll see if we can get some research on that. But the truth is, there's enough people who it's not just their legs, because that's truthfully the only place where you could probably have a motor disability where it doesn't impact the use of the web, right, would be if it's your legs. Because just about anywhere else, and it's going to become difficult for you. So that's a partial answer, but I'll try and get some more on that. But yeah, it's mostly people. There's a lot of people who are coming back from armed conflicts and war that come back and they have damage done from injuries and combat. And that's something that's actually been on the rise as well. Any other questions? Yes?
Can sometimes designing for disabled people impact normal users?
So the question is, can sometimes designing for disabled people impact normal users? And that's a great question. I think that the real question would be, what are you designing for normal users that, the short answer is no. But when you design, there's Susanna Gonzalez from Smashing Magazine basically talks about how none of us are really normal users, because we're all on this continuum, whether it's a temporary disability or something that somebody's aging into those disabilities, or if you happen to be wearing glasses, that's something that is somewhat, of an impairment. And we've seen time and time again that things that are done to improve accessibility actually increase the usability for others. So the short answer is no, there's really not something that impacts negatively for people who don't have disabilities if you design correctly for people with disabilities. Because the idea is you're not really designing specifically for disability. What you're designing is a universal design approach. It's actually one of the wonderful things about Norway is that the legislation for accessibility in Norway actually says that instead of designing more than one experience for people and say separate but equal, the goal is to design the same experience and have multiple ways to be able to accomplish the same task. So there's nothing that we've seen. Color contrast helps people, it helps everyone. Designing things with proximity in mind helps everyone. It really increases conversion rate for things when they're more usable. Yes? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I have some example in mind, like especially with colors. High contrast is better for people with vision issues, but using colors sometimes helps as well. And if we reduce the colors to put high contrast, then there's some kind of contradiction. So how do you?
So the color contrast requirements from a technical point of view from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines states that normal text has to have a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1, and larger text is 3 to 1. So we're not talking about a high contrast, we're talking about a reasonable level of contrast. So people who need higher contrast than that typically will enable a theme or a custom style sheet. So in Windows, there's something called high contrast themes, and they'll use that if they need significant contrast. So as long as you kind of get out of the user's way and allow them to be able to effectively use their own tools, that's really what we're talking about. And so regular contrast is not usually very challenging for organizations. Orange and green can be tricky at times to be able to put text against, but a lot of times people will find that what we're talking about is text against a background. We're not talking about all the colors of your brand palette. We're talking about what you use to communicate text information, right? So instead of using that really thin, tiny gray font to be able to make a very artistic statement, you know, use a little bit darker gray, like a dark gray works fine. It doesn't have to be a black and white website in order for it to function well. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you guys very much, and enjoy the conference. I appreciate it. Oh, and there's voting outside with really cool Post-its that unfortunately do use color to convey meaning, but we'll give you guys a pass on that. And so vote if you enjoyed it. What's that? Mm-hmm.